Hey, I am Noah Gibbs. I'm here to talk to you today about visual storytelling. So I give a bunch of talks, especially about computer programming, software development. They're pretty okay. Um, but mostly, I'm going to be quoting to you today from amazing sources. Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, Will Eisner's Comics and Sequential Art, several books about design. But comics, why comics? A presentation, a slide presentation like this is basically a slow motion comic. I mean, later we'll talk about exactly how. But what's visual storytelling? Here I am, telling you about visual storytelling. What do I mean by that? And it's hard to get consensus about this phrase online. You can Google it, but it's hard to get a strong idea of exactly what it means. I saw this amazing thing that the best presenters did in their presentations. Um, Artists and photographers are good at it. Sandy Metz, a tech presenter, is very, very good at it. And I spent years trying to figure out exactly what they were doing and then how you get good at it. And I think I did eventually. Um, so what is visual storytelling? What is this thing they did that I looked at and went, oh wow, I need this, and I eventually figured it out. One part of it is composition. That's how you arrange the things on the page. Um, where on the page you put objects, what things are next to what. These sets of circles that you see here are very similar. Each set is 4 circles, about the same size as each other. Sometimes one of them's blue. And even just trivially like this, each set of 4 feels different from the others. People will read storytelling into anything. That's great. You should use that. Visual storytelling is also eye movement. If you're looking at this, what do you see and when? You've probably seen the meme before, it's a cute one. But in a presentation more than a comic, it matters what you see first in the image and how your eyes move around it. Really, in both of them, it matters a lot. Visual storytelling is identification, who or what feels like you when you look at it. So that's something slide presentations usually are terrible at. When you put together a slide presentation, you don't usually pay enough attention to who the audience is rooting for, who they sympathize with, who they feel like. We're going to talk about some rules for what feels like the audience to the audience, what feels like a main character, even if you're not telling a storybook-style story. Like this is a useful enough rule that you don't have to do little chalk or marker type characters like this if you don't want to. You can still use it. And we'll show some examples of that. Visual storytelling is also about sequence. How do you go from one image to the next? This was the first thing that struck me about it, was, oh wow, these slides have sort of a continuity. They're telling a little story, thing by thing. In comics, you go panel to panel. In slide decks, the presenter controls when people see the panels, and that's a little different, but mostly it's the same. How do you get from one thing to the next? How do you get from one piece of text to the next, one picture to the next? So we're going to talk in more detail about each of those things I just mentioned. Composition is an enormous topic, but let's hit the extreme basics of it just very briefly, sort of the smallest useful amount for you to know. So composition's about what you put in the frame, where you put it in the frame. Cool. Doing it by feel is great. Like you don't have to know a bunch of formal rules to do this. It's good to know that there's a whole field of study that wants to help you with it. Part of what you need to know is that your job when you're making a presentation is picking where to put things in your slides. There are standard rules for it, like balance, which you see there. About what things feel more or less balanced. But if your slides are individually ugly or bad feeling, maybe study some of those rules. There are sources at the end of this slide deck, and mostly in today we're going to talk about the other parts of visual storytelling, because there are great books and articles about composition. When in doubt, use more white space and less text, less objects. Try to make your slides less busy, because that'll make everything else you do more effective. All right, so eye movement. What about eye movement? How do your eyes move through an image? What does the audience see first? What do they treat as important? Also a big topic. But visual weight. That's the phrase you're talking about for that. Warmer colors, red, orange, yellow, they feel closer to you than cooler colors. They advance. They feel like they come toward you. Cooler colors are blue, green, purple, which sort of recede. They feel like they're moving away from you. So that's part of where visual weight comes from, is the warm colors come toward you. English reading audiences usually scan left, right, and top to bottom. If you read a different language, you're going to probably follow its scan order. That's how you're used to moving your eyes across things. But if you're used to reading English, you'll usually scan left to right and then top to bottom. Things that are centered are eye-catching. You often look, right toward the center of things, so something that's right in the center is eye-catching. High color contrast, a big difference between two adjacent colors, is eye-catching. Faces, people are eye-catching. Big objects and text are eye-catching. Variety is eye-catching. And by eye-catching, I mean it has significant visual weight. So that's a lot of what you're going to see first, is the thing with more visual weight. Your eye also tends to follow people, where they look, where they point, what they find interesting. You want to remember this for your clip art and your stock photos. You want whatever's in the stock photo, or the clip art or whatever, to be pointing or looking at the interesting parts of your slide, the things that you want your audience to look at, because your audience is going to unconsciously look too. They're going to look at that and go, oh, what are they looking at? In this case, things like kittens totally count as people. Like kittens in your stock photos, people are going to look at what the kitten's looking at. They're going to look at what the kitten's pointing to. They're going to look at, where the attention is. I certainly look at kittens. I mean, you look at animals just like you look at people. You sort of look and go, oh, what are they looking at? And that's a lot of what you're seeing back here, is the people are looking at the big gold question mark here. And it's interesting because the people act like it's interesting. Directing the eye, again, eye movement, but you deciding sort of where it goes. Painters are often really good at this. A painter, of course, fully makes everything. A photographer has to catch a scene that's already there, but a painter, they put every person where they want them. They can put every piece of the background where they want them. They can put the angle of everything exactly where they want it. So painters are often masterful at this. This is a classic example, public domain image from 1891. My eye moves around this painting a lot when I look at it. You'll probably find it similar. Like, it's an interesting painting. So let's look at Anton Gorlin's analysis of it. He has a great introduction to composition and visual storytelling that's linked, later on in this. But if you can see the little lines there, there's a sort of a blue spiral that goes around the far outside of the image and winds up on the guy with the big white puffy hat that's laughing. There's a green spiral that goes the other direction around and ends with the little guy with the pen in the middle. And there are those red lines that you can see coming down to the hand containing the pen. And what he's showing you there is that a lot of the angles of the faces slope down to where the pen is. And again, there's lots going on here. There's lots moving around. There's lots of interesting stuff to look at. But it's hard not to notice when you look at it for a while that little guy in the middle is where your eye keeps coming back to. He's probably the least interesting person in the entire thing. But all of those lines point down to him. The big crowd of people are all sort of facing toward him. Their heads are facing toward him. They're all interested in where he is. And so even though he's nothing special, you keep coming back to right where he is because of the flow of these lines through the painting. And again, it's because you're looking at where people look. You're looking at where people are pointed toward. You're looking where the lines of their faces and their weapons and whatnot are. So yeah, you can do a lot to intentionally move the eye through the image. Cool. All right, move the eye through the image. Identification. This is a harder one to go out and just find out about. Like, this is harder to Google. What feels like you? So the first thing I'm going to do for this section is I'm going to just steal a little chunk of Scott McCloud's wonderful book, Understanding Comics, because it's so good. It's so good and helps you understand this field so thoroughly. All of Understanding Comics is worth your time. It's good, and it's even better in context, but today we'll get the massive abbreviated version with me. So, when two people interact, they usually look directly at one another, seeing their partner's features, the person they're talking to's features, in vivid detail. He's seeing her, she's seeing him, and they've both got a strong idea of what the other person looks like. Each one also sustains a constant awareness of his or her own face, but that mind picture is not nearly so vivid. It's just a sketchy arrangement, a sense of shape, a sense of general placement. You know where your nose is, you know where your tongue is, but you don't know exactly what it looks like every moment. Not while you're talking, of course you don't. Something as simple and basic as a cartoon. So, when you look at a photo or a realistic drawing of a face, like the fellow with the strong shadows on his face there in the picture, like the two that you're watching talking to each other, you see it as the face of another person. It's as though you're speaking to them. But when you enter the world of the cartoon, you see yourself. And so he shows that just very simplified little picture with a line mouth, two dots for eyes. Seeing a really simplified figure like that feels like you. If you're skeptical of this, I get it. That makes sense. But also notice how easy it is to feel skeptical when I show you a little cartoony face, showing you what to feel. And of course, you don't need my supreme mastery of stick figures to make this trick work for you, but that is one way to do it. What else? What else makes you identify with people? Well, audiences like a bias for action. Audiences like characters who do something. Even if somebody isn't otherwise very much your type, seeing things from their viewpoint will tend to make you think like them, even for just a moment. Emotion is good. Seeing somebody sad, mad, happy, or whatever, helps you feel the same way. You probably don't think of yourself as a lot like a bank robber, but you see this guy, in a good mood. He's got all the money from the vault, and then the alarms ring, and he's dropping it. It's hard not to feel that catch in your throat for just a moment with the he's, oh shoot, what do I do now? Um, Audiences like to see somebody do something. Bias for action, that's what I mean. And consistency. As you make your presentation, you're going to pick some meanings for things and keep using those same meanings. Your audience will notice even if they don't realize they do. So you've probably caught on with me playing tricks with colors. Anybody notice how I use green for all the figures you're supposed to identify with here? People watch colors, shapes, line thicknesses, fonts, all sorts of things, and you can use that. It's not that you have to monitor everything. You can't. You can't. But pick 2 or 3 things and use them in a consistent way, like me using the simplified green stick figures to mean, hey, this is who I want you to identify with. And so that's identification in a nutshell, really quickly. But we haven't talked about sequence much, presenting one image after another in order. And that's the only thing we're going to talk about today, where making a slideshow, you have an actual advantage over comics. You have something that's more powerful than what comics get. And that's because you, the presenter, get to pick exactly what the audience sees and when, the order and the timing. You control the narration. Whereas a comic, it turns out they can, scrub their eyes back and forth as often as they want, and as the person who wrote the comic, you don't get to control that. But the thing to remember with a series of images or a series of words is that the action happens in the gaps. It happens in between. When you show people a series of frames, a series of images, a series of words, they assume what happens in between. And you can use that by connecting one slide to the next in some way. That can be as obvious as successive comics panels or animated fire transitions in PowerPoint, but it can be subtle. Color or a background carries over. So when I say action is in the gaps, you can see a thing happening and it feels clear. The little guy is walking toward the water. The little guy notices the water and he's about to fall in. The fish comes out and grabs him. In the second panel, was he seeing the fish and trying to get back, but he couldn't? I don't know, but you assumed one or the other. There was that gap. The stuff that you couldn't see happened, and your brain immediately filled something in. And not necessarily the same exact thing everybody else did. But the action, the transitions all happen in between, and if it's not in the gaps between 2 pictures on the same frame, on the same slide, it'll still happen between slides. The action happens in the gaps in between what you present, and that's what you need to keep in mind. So this is feeling a little theoretical. We've had some good examples, but it's feeling a little theoretical. So let's take an example of a presentation and how we could turn something standard, by which I mean bad, into something a little bit better. And what if you don't want to do everything in stick figures, right? I mean, I love stick figures, but maybe that's not your thing. Maybe you don't like drawing stick figures. Maybe, stick figures aren't appropriate for whatever you're doing. So let's do a couple of slides worth of not stick figures as examples. So, it turns out I went and I searched for example PowerPoint presentation, and the first link was 20 great examples of PowerPoint presentations from HubSpot. They're not great. They're really not. But on their top 20 list, number three on their top 20 list was this monstrosity. Accelerating innovation in energy, how Accenture is driving digital transformation with OSDU. Balancing visual backgrounds with text isn't easy. More often than not, the text is formatted in a way that winds up getting lost in the image. This presentation from Accenture combated this issue by combining shapes and graphics to create contrast between the text and the background. Well done. Well, if you're going to give them credit for something, contrast between the foreground and the background, sure. Yeah, the black on white there is fine. No, this is terrible, but let's have a look at how we could make it less terrible. Now, there's always a story. I say but there's no story here. Of course, there's a story. There's always a story. It may not be a story that they're telling like a story, but there's always a story. And in fact, you can just read the title slide, and it turns out you do know what the story is. Now, we're not going to fix the story. That's not what we're doing here. We're doing visual storytelling of a story they already picked. So however bad the story is, we're keeping their same story. But we'll tell it better. Here's the story. How Accenture is driving digital transformation. Yeah, you get it. You've already heard me say it. But that is the story. There's a hero of the story, Accenture. It's right there. How Accenture is, etc. And what's it doing? Driving digital transformation, accelerating innovation in energy. We could be silly. We could literally show a little Accenture logo like driving the words around like a car. That would still be better than what they did. But let's play it straight. Let's pretend it's a business presentation. How do we fix this, have it still feel like a business presentation, but make it not awful? So this is a free picture from Unsplash. I give credit down there. You could also, pay for it or otherwise deal with it. But like, it's free. You just, give a credit and you're allowed to use it. I used the built-in Keynote tools for this, and it's like 5 minutes of work. And already this is much better. And it's way more honest about what it's doing. If you're going to make it all about Accenture, then you should own that. Your audience will figure it out, no matter what you do. I promise. So what did we do here? Well, how do you tell a story? First, you had a person or a person stand-in. Remember all that identification stuff I talk about? It doesn't have to be a green marker stick figure. It can also be a dramatic silhouette of somebody with, bright light behind them, raising a fist and looking awesome. So, person or person stand-in. There's our person. Very generic is good. And you'll notice with the silhouette, like there are some things you can tell about her, but she's a very generic person because you can't see almost anything about her. Make it clear what to look at. She's centered. She's right there. She's holding her fist up like there's almost nothing to compete with her. You can tell. She's what you're supposed to be looking at. So, eye movement, right to the center. Identification. There's your person presented as being awesome. Presented as look, they're cool. Pointing up at Accenture. Because that's who it's supposed to be, and then framed by the title and the subtitle to again say, this is important. This is still all about Accenture, and frankly it's still too wordy, but those are the parts we're intentionally not fixing. This is, again, already much, much better than that little horrible black and electric purple thing. So let's go to slide 2. I'm sorry, we won't go through the whole thing, but we'll look a little more about what you can fix. We'll go beyond the title slide slightly. So, over the last few decades, the challenges in the oil and gas industry have increased in quantity and complexity. Technology evolved at unprecedented rates, becoming cheaper, more accessible, and highly intelligent. Data exploded in volume, velocity, and veracity. Okay, technology has evolved. Data has exploded. The need to collaborate, do more with less. Can you think of ways to identify, to illustrate these ideas better? Obviously you can. Obviously you can. I mean, first off, stop putting all the text on the slides and then, having the audience read it as you read it. But even beyond that, some kind of illustration, a drawing, a stock photo, clip art, anything. And this writing isn't terrible. Technology evolved is a great phrase. You could illustrate with, like, the Matrix-style columns of falling symbols or dinosaurs. They evolved. Mantis shrimp, all about evolution there. All kinds of visually interesting things. And so they chose a triangle. Do you identify with a triangle? Hint, most people don't, especially because it's all pointy. And data exploded. There are good action verbs here. There are things they could have done, and they really just didn't. You could say, but this is an Accenture presentation. Aren't they contractually required to be boring? And the answer, sadly, is no. No, they chose this. This is all awful, even though they could do anything better. And so can you. I mean, really, data exploded. Like, that has an action verb. You can illustrate that. It's a great action verb. And they illustrated with another purple triangle, plus making you read it off the slide. So, another just really quick, a couple of Unsplash images that I chose with really generic search terms, like technology and collaboration. It's about 5 minutes work. You don't have to get rid of all that text completely. You can put it in the presenter notes, and then you can say it, and then the audience isn't reading it at the same time, distracting them and you. But don't print it on the slide. And this isn't a great redo with, 10 to 15 minutes. You could do a lot better. But the original version is actively hostile. It makes you feel distant and unengaged. It pushes you away. This is all with free photos from Unsplash, gotten with obvious, like collaborate and technology were the terms I use for these. Okay, that's enough Accenture. Too much, really. So let's talk about how to use this. Let's talk about some things you can do to sort of bring your art forward. Even a little bit helps. I know the amount that we've gone over here is overwhelming. There's a lot of it. There is. The thing to keep in mind is this. Most people do none of it. Every little bit you do is an improvement. Pick something that feels natural. Any part of this, whatever sort of connects with you, and do a little bit of that. You are already ahead of the game. Most people don't even begin to do that much. And people are already looking for meaning in your slides. The words, the pictures, the gaps. Like they're sitting looking at you, right? They chose to come to your presentation. Try just a little to meet them halfway, and you've done far more than most presenters ever get around to doing. You can get away with a huge amount of symbolism, but even trivial things like showing somebody climbing a mountain for a journey, or literally just people typing is enormously better than nothing. And Unsplash photos are free, even if you don't like, stick figure drawings like I do. Also have a theme. Have an overall theme to your presentation, a theme to your colors, probably to your stock images. As a side effect, that lets you pick just a few searches on Google Images or Unsplash or wherever you're searching and just download everything that looks good that matches your search terms. But like pick, I don't know, a desert journey, pick mountains, pick industrial buildings in big cities. Pick some visual theme that you like and go with it. And as a side effect, that makes questions like, what colors should I use? Or should I have background images? A lot easier to answer. For background images, yes, but keep them subtle. So like transparency is really good. In fact, so transparent you can barely see it is really good. It's surprisingly effective. But why a theme? Why a theme? Because the trick to art is to make things seem intentional. They don't have to be good. They don't have to be skilled. You've been looking through my little stick figure things for a while here. They have to feel intentional. If you use ducks everywhere, nobody is going to say, did the presenter mean to include 26 ducks? Like, no, it's clearly intentional. You don't have to be a skilled artist to be intentional. You just have to mean to do something, and then do it. One more artist's trick before we go. Squint and step back. So once you get the slide done, look at the slide, take a step back, take maybe another few steps back. Step back until you can't see the text on your slide clearly. So way back, because you're using huge fonts, right? Right? Huge fonts. But what you can still see as it starts to blur out is the important part. If what you see is not what you think ought to be the important part, change the composition, change what's big, change what's prominent, change what's brightly colored, until the thing you think is supposed to be important is what you can see when you step back and squint. So step back and squint, make sure the right thing is prominent. The important stuff should be big and visible. Lots of visible weight. Silly is fine. Important stuff should still be important even if you're silly. Silly is okay if the presentation still works. So all right, hit the summary quick. What's visual storytelling? Composition, what goes where on the slide. Eye movement, what you look at and when you look at it. Identification, which is the bit that feels like you, feels like a main character. Sequence, going from image to image, or whatever you're transferring between, going from one to the next. I promised you some sources. These are some sources. There's a URL at the bottom with these same exact sources. But Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics, really, really good. It's essentially an art and almost a literary criticism book about the medium of comics, which turns out to be really applicable to this and a number of other things. If you're looking for a basic design book, including but not limited to composition. I like David Kadavi's book, Design for Hackers, Reverse Engineering Beauty. You don't have to have a design for computer programmers book. Like if you have a basic design book is a basic design book. Find a good one. There are lots of good ones. But if you want one that's sort of skewed toward programmers, David Kadavi's book, it's good. Anton Gorlin's Guide to Composition here. Unlike the previous two, it is not a book, it's free, so you can just go over to it, but Anton Gorlin's Photography and Composition, the Definitive Guide, is very much about visual storytelling. This was actually one of the first places I found an explanation of visual storytelling that made sense to me, and it includes a lot of the same components I've been talking to you about today. It's also going to take you a while to read it. It's enormous. Will Eisner's book, Comics and Sequential Art. So if you like the comics angle, if that works for you, that is a very good book about composing your comics, about what goes where in the panel, about what the audience feels about it. But it's very comics focused. It's seriously meant for people who are going to draw comics, often for a living. So if this really, grabbed you, fantastic. If the comics thing is not working for you, I wouldn't bother with the Eisner book, even though it's a very good book. Cool. Well, ordinarily I would say, what are your questions? But since today you're viewing a recording, I'll say I'd love to hear from you. If you've got any thoughts on this, I would love to hear those thoughts. I think this is a really cool thing. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I'm glad I got to talk to you today.